Hi, Misha here, and it's time to cover the Beau, Britain's Bristol Beaufighter, an interesting aircraft from World War II that served many roles, but is often kind of overlooked today. So I'm going to break down the history, the variants. As usual, ramble on for a bit. I have 3 models out right now, all 1/72 scale diecast. On the left, we have a Hobby Master Mark.1C, meaning it was used by RAF Coastal Command. So, kind of a maritime version. Then we have a Mark.6F, used by the RAF as a night fighter. And finally, and this is the model I've actually been waiting on for a few months before doing the video, we have a TF Mark 10, the most produced version, and pretty much the last major version in the series. So we're gonna kind of go through each of these, because they kind of have their own unique roles, and talk about what this aircraft did with over 5,500 produced during the war. It certainly did something. Well, let's get into it. Alright, well, I have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm either going to have to skip over things or ramble on forever. Whichever it kind of ends up happening, I apologize for those that it bothers. I really do. The Bristol Beaufighter story begins with this plane here. This is Bristol's Blenheim. In itself has an interesting story. This dates back to the early 1930s, and what was planned to be a fast, modern passenger transport for the commercial civilian market. But the military became interested, and so Bristol made a version for them. The original version was known as the Type 142, and the militarized version was known as the Type 142M. I'll let you guess what the M stands for. And it entered into service, well, it first flew in 1935, and at the time it was one of the fastest, if not the fastest, twin-engine plane around. It entered into service in 1937 as a light bomber and reconnaissance plane. But then fighter tech was just jumping leaps and bounds. So what was very cutting edge just a couple of years earlier was already getting surpassed by newer designs on the boards. Then in 1938, the Munich crisis happened with Nazi Germany, which made some shortcomings in the RAF apparent, and Bristol knew, or at least thought they knew, and they were correct, that they needed a new heavy fighter, interceptor, interdictor, intruder. Now, there was another aircraft we should talk about. Based on the Blenheim here, it was known as the Beaufort, or Beaufort. It was an upgraded version of this aircraft, meant to be a torpedo bomber, although it could do conventional bombing as well. It first flew in 1938 when it was adopted into service. So they took the Beaufort, which was based on the Blenheim, and they very quickly developed the Beaufighter. They pretty much used the same fuselage. They started working on the design in September of 1938, and by October they pretty much had a proposal ready. In November, the Air Ministry gave them the go-ahead to develop prototypes. One thing though, Bristol wanted to use the new Hercules engine, and the Air Ministry didn't object. However, several bombers, namely the Sterling, kind of had priority for the engine. So if not enough engines were available, they wanted Bristol to develop an alternative that could use something like the Merlin engine. Keep that in mind. In March of 1939, it would be given the name Beaufort. Excuse me, I do that in every video. I don't know why. I think I like saying Beaufort. I know I should say Beaufort, but Beaufort just seems fun. It was given the name Beaufighter. And even before the prototype flew, the RAF ordered 300. The prototype did fly in July of 1939. It was unarmed at that time. And it reached a speed of about 335 miles per hour. It's a little lower than what they were hoping for, but it was still an improvement over the Blenheim. This was a very fast aircraft years earlier, but once it became militarized, its top speed dropped below 270 miles per hour. So the Beaufighter was still quite a bit faster. However, that was unarmed. When they flew the second armed prototype, it only reached about 310 miles per hour. And many were not happy about this. But, of course, war was going on. You know, yeah, what could you do? By 1940, over 900 were on order, and plans were made to start up secondary production lines at Ferry, and Bristol would open up a secondary one. The first aircraft were delivered for operational evaluation, squadron evaluation in August of 1940. And the first production models were delivered on September 2nd, 1940. And they started flying them, testing just a few days later. And then they started flying routine missions by September 17th. Now those were actually the MK.F version, made for fighter command, which I'm going to kind of skip around a bit here just to be accurate. I will say that because the Blenheim was so slow, it did not do well as a light bomber for multiple reasons. It was not a good ground attack or strafer because originally it was only equipped with a couple of 303 machine guns with the Mark I. But it was a large aircraft, a small bomber, but a large aircraft. So what they did, because they needed one desperately, they made it into a night fighter, hence the Mark I F. Or sometimes I've seen it NF. They installed in the bomb bay a gun pack with 4 303 machine guns, and more importantly, Britain had been working on what was known as Aerial Intercept Radar, AI radar for short. Basically independent working aircraft radar, primarily to be used at night, but also in bad weather, to defend London, mostly. And it was advanced, but it was also heavy and large. Much too large to fit on faster fighters of the day, like the Spitfire or Hurricane. So it was put on the Blenheim because it had the space and the ability to fly with it. So this actually found itself a pretty good niche in 1940 as an ad hoc night fighter, and had a much better record. Not perfect, but it downed multiple German bombers and saved many British lives. But it's still only equipped with 4 to 5 forward-facing 303 machine guns, and then at this time with the Mark I, 1 turreted 303 machine gun. No cannons. It's still not very fast. And it has kind of an odd cockpit, to say the least. And it has a crew of 3, one of which really wasn't needed in the night fighter role, but it would be made do until its replacement would show up. Now that was the F for Fighter Command. A short time after they started receiving their Beaufighters, the RAF Coastal Command, primarily long-range operating over water, patrolling, protecting shipping lanes, protecting anti-submarine aircraft, yada yada. They became interested as well. So Bristol started working on additional fuel tanks to give it better range. And the Coastal Command had other requirements and changes. They weren't so much interested in using it for a night fighter, but more as a daytime convoy escort and anti-shipping aircraft. And so, in March of 1941, Bristol would deliver the first of what would become known as the Mark I-C to the Coastal Command. And they would quickly train up a squad and station them on Malta by April. And they would very, very quickly start flying sorties in that region. Actually, they would still fly these out on Malta for the rest of the war because it just proved to be a good combination. But by June, they had claimed nearly 50 enemy aircraft shot down and over 40 at least damaged. Now, at this point, the early Mark I-Cs were kind of transitional models. The first 100 or so lacked the fuel tanks specific to this one. They were actually kind of stolen from the Wellington bomber. Later ones would get fuel tanks for the wings specifically made for the Beaufighter. They would be armed with 4 20mm cannon in the nose. The earliest Mark I's, that's all they would have, because that was kind of what was originally designed in 1938. But very quickly, they would add 6 303 machine guns, 2 on the port side and 4 on the starboard. This was based, like I said, on the Beaufort bomber, so you can see some vestiges of that. It did not have an internal bomb bay, rather that would be used for equipment or fuel, but you have this rear position back here that once was a turret. Now it's considered an observation blister. And this role is a Coastal Command, primarily daytime maritime aircraft, that would be where the navigator sat. And one of the things that they needed to add was a navigation table. They also gave additional directional finding navigation equipment, so that was his job, was not to get lost over the ocean. Pretty damn important, especially before GPS. He also had another very important job. These 20mm cannon in the beginning were fed by drum magazines with 60 rounds each, so they would run out quite quickly. It was the guys in the back's job to swap the drums out. In the front, we have a cockpit, which is one person. He's the pilot, of course. The fuselage is kind of fat and bulbous because it is based on the Beaufort and Blenheim bombers, which kind of would be one of this aircraft's shortcomings. It was big, it was heavy. It's nearly a bomber itself. When they armed it up like this with the Hercules engines, it could do about 320 miles per hour, so not a huge decrease, thankfully. They did go ahead and pursue the Merlin version, but they knew from the outset that these were less powerful engines. This would become the Mark II. They would make about 450 of them, but, compared to the rest, not that much. And unfortunately, their top speed wasn't much over 300 miles per hour when armed up. And from what I gather, many of the Mark IIs would go to the Fleet Air Arm of the Royal Navy. It seems like the RAF definitely preferred the Hercules versions. And I've read conflicting reports on maximum altitude. It probably depends on load and everything. It's anywhere from about 20,000 feet to about 27,000 feet. But yeah, these were used to attack transport aircraft and whatnot. Then the Coastal Command started using these as anti-shipping. They would strafe enemy vessels, again with 10 guns facing forward. Even if 6 were smaller caliber, they could put some damage on. And this version had more range and endurance. Some versions of the Beaufighter could stay aloft for 6 hours. Very good for that time. They would also be used to support the 8th Army in 1942 in North Africa. They would provide close air support and ground attack. And the Coastal Command was so taken with them that for a time in 1942, it was the biggest user of the Beaufighter. So much so that the entire production line established at Ferry made Coastal Command variants. But with that said, what about Fighter Command? Now we get to the Night Fighter. And I didn't start with this one because this is actually a Mark VI. And the Coastal Command I have is a Mark I. So, older version. Even if the Striker aircraft came into service later. Like I said, these were going into production in the summer of 1940. There have been a few delays because of engines and whatnot, but really this was developed remarkably quick considering everything. It went from being the Type 156 prototype to the Beaufighter Mark I in about 8 months. So yeah, they started testing these in August, test flights in September. First patrols were pretty uneventful. The Beaufighter would get its first confirmed kill on October 25th of 1940, but it was not done with AI radar. Actually, they would have to wait till November before the first radar-directed kill intercept. Some sources say November 11, some say November 19th, most say the 19th, but anyway, I thought I'd mention it. Actually, these were delivered without radar initially, and so they had to be retrofitted in the fall of 1940. However, by 1941, January, they started to come from the factory with AI radar installed, and the radar was being improved all the time. Clarity, weight, size, durability, just Britain was really focusing on it. Like I said, the Blenheim had been kind of pressed into the night fighter role because of the Blitz. But it wasn't the only one. I also brought out another cool little plane, just to mention, the Boughton-Paul Defiant. This is a 2-seat, turreted fighter interceptor. It's a little under 35 feet long and 40 feet wingspan, so not small, but still smaller than the Beaufighter, which is about 58 feet wingspan and 42 feet long. And of course this had 2 engines. The Defiant, much like the Blenheim, was a really good idea in the 30s, but even though the first prototype flew in 1935, it wasn't actually ready to go until basically 1940 because the turret wasn't ready till 1938. That was the Mark I. It was a daytime interceptor. It was only equipped with the 4 303 machine guns in the turret. And once this heavy turret was added, it could barely get over 300 miles per hour. So faster than the Blenheim, but very slow, and getting slower every day compared to the newer German aircraft in 1939-1940. In fact, these were getting decimated during daytime use. So beginning in mid-1940, they started sending Defiants on nighttime intercepts. And immediately they did better. Now in the beginning they were using Mark I eyeballs and spotlights, but this was just big enough with some compromises to mount some AI radar after they went to the new improved Mark II with a more powerful engine. The trade-off was its duration in the air was about 1.5 hours. And for a nighttime interceptor, you want to keep it up patrolling as long as possible. Really, the Defiant is a cool plane, but was not very successful. They only built just over 1,000, and once the Blenheim and especially Beaufighter were coming online, these were pretty much pulled out of service by 1942, and then either given to allies or made into trainers. But I just wanted to show you another plane that was flying. This, on the other hand, did very well as a night fighter because even though it was a bit of a rush job, it was designed with the AI radar in mind. In the beginning, they didn't have the best skill record. A lot of pilots were getting used to the new airplane. Also, the AI radar still had a lot of bugs to work out. But by the spring of 1941, things were really coming together. And a short time later, about half of all airplanes downed over England were attributed to Beaufighters. Now, much like the Coastal Command version, this had 10 guns, 4 cannon, 6 machine guns. And the rear position did the same duties. He was an observer. He would reload the cannon. But instead of being more of a navigator, he was a radar intercept officer. He monitored the scope and directed the pilot. Now, like I said, this is a Mark 6, so it's a little different. The original Mark 1F had a slightly different shape to the nose because it used an older pattern of radar. But anywho, these would not just be flown in England, they would be used for reconnaissance and raids over Europe as well. And really by late 1941, the nighttime German threat was abating. A lot of it had to do with the Eastern Front really heating up for Germany, and they're having to pull resources off of Britain, which gave them some breathing room. And then in 1942, our new version here appears. Around March or April, we have both a Mark 6F and a Mark 6C. They have improved radar, clearer, more accurate, easier to use. The only difference is they had to put this extension on the nose to house the antennae. The attempts to use Merlin engines in the Mark II didn't go much anywhere, so these still used just a new pattern of Hercules uprated engine. The newer engines gave some advantages. It didn't really give it a lot better speed, about 10 miles, 15 miles faster. I think the max speed for a lot of these is around 330 to 335 miles per hour again, kind of getting back to what the unarmed prototype did. But what they could do was carry more. They had more lift. That was good. We can carry more radar stuff if we need to, but really this allowed them to integrate some new features. For one, they can carry about 75 gallons more in fuel. They can also now mount a couple of bombs under the wings that they have hard points. They can carry 2 250-pound bombs, or later on rockets. And they would also go to a new feeding system finally for the 20mm cannon. They would get away from the drum system and go to a much better belt system. It's more efficient and freed up the guy in the back to actually do things. And so yeah, they were just improving it all the time. And the Mark 6 would very quickly eclipse the Mark 1 and 2. What about the Marks 3 and 4? Well, they were designs, but they never were put into production. They were slim-bodied. They were trying to get away from the Beaufort fat body for better speed. And they'd actually tried these out for years, but it just never happened. One had the Hercules engine, the other one was fitted to use the Griffin engine, I believe. And yeah, they just never took off, so yeah, they didn't just ignore them, they just, yeah. Okay, what about the Mark 5? Well, it's another reason I brought the little Defiant out. A Mark 5 was a design that used this type of 4 machine gun turret. It would replace the observation blister in the back, basically restoring the turret like on the Beaufort. the trade-off was they deleted 2 out of the 4 20mm cannon in the front and all 6 of the machine guns in the wings to accommodate this. But it was hoped to give better coverage, especially covering kind of a blind spot that they discovered in the aircraft where, yeah, coming from above, it didn't have a whole lot to defend itself. This is, keeping in mind by 1942, this is kind of a slow aircraft. They did make 2 prototypes, and they even did put them in the field in mid-1941, but it was just decided the trade-off was not worth the advantage. So there was even a Mark V. So you see, they're not just completely drunk at the job when it comes to naming stuff. In June of 1942, there was a very famous case where a Beaufighter flew over occupied Paris, Vichy, France, and dropped a French tricolor on the Eiffel Tower, and also did a perfunctory strafing of the German headquarters there. Kind of a token thing, but a morale booster, not unlike the Doolittle raids that happened just a couple of months earlier in the Pacific. And these would continue to fly over Europe, specifically France and Belgium, harassing Germans, reconnaissance, and now that they could carry bombs, even if it's just a couple, that plus the cannons gave them a pretty respectable ground attack ability. Indeed, indeed. And it's also around this time these started to be seen in the Pacific. British Beaufighters would appear there around April and May, and would be used for long-range patrols, strafing, ground support. They would also be used for night missions, but not as much as they would be in Europe. Usually when they were used for night missions, they were flying out of India, kind of in the East or Southeast Asian theater. The long-range patrols are more out of, the Australia region, Southwest. But yeah, one early battle these took part in was the battle for the Bismarck Sea, in which Beaufighters escorted American B-25 Mitchells and A-20 attack aircraft against a Japanese convoy, and they helped sink 4 destroyers, 8 transports, and did some other damage. And for this, they just used their cannons to strafe the ships. And of course, help protect the actual bombers, which the American planes were doing bombing. They mostly used skip bombing at that time. And had a pretty good record. Only 1 Beaufighter was lost in that battle, and actually only 5 planes total were lost. Not a bad trade-off for a dozen Japanese vessels. Well, let's move on. I had to take a little break there. Hope you enjoy these. Appreciate you tuning in. For whatever odd reason, I find these very relaxing and rewarding. I always feel good after recording one. That said, I think my wife thinks I'm nuts. She's probably not wrong. Oh, one other change I forgot to mention when they went to the Mark VI. They went to a new dihedral tail, upswept tail. That was to correct a little bit of stability, and also this would be carrying heavier loads. The C version of the Mark VI was quite similar to the F, but they went one step further. I'm going to talk about those in just a minute. Like I said, these were coming into use in 1942, and they would continue night fighting roles and patrol more than straight up interception. They were used more and more as intruders there in the Pacific, and the Australians really liked them. Had a very good reputation with the Aussies. They appreciated the plane's durability, dependability. This thing could really take a lick. The trade-off was it was a bit of a bitch to take off. It wanted to swerve because of the engines, the torque from the powerful Hercules engines, especially as you get into later marks, would try to twist it, so you had to kind of fight it to get it off the ground. But once in the air, that of course went away. And also landing could be interesting. But again, it handled well in the air, and it could really take a beating. But interestingly, as these were coming into use in the Pacific, they were actually going kind of out of use, at least in the night fighter role, in Europe. Part of it, like I said, was that German attacks, night attacks over England, were reducing. So Britain was going more and more on the offense. And another aircraft was coming online, the de Havilland Mosquito. And they would make two versions of this. There would be a fighter and a bomber version. This is the bomber, and these would be used for nighttime intruder raids over Germany, dropping bombs, as well as reconnaissance. And in 1942, this started to replace the Beaufighter, which itself had just recently replaced the other planes. It had a crew of 2, it had that narrow fuselage, but its main asset was how fast it was. It could get over 400 miles per hour. So nearly 100 miles faster than some versions of the Beaufighter. And it was made of wood. So they would serve alongside in the night role, covering Europe for a time, but by relatively late 1943, they had plenty of mosquitoes, and so the Beaufighter was taken out of night duty in the RAF. Now, in 1943, 100 Beaufighters were loaned to the U.S. Army Air Force to be used mostly in the Mediterranean theater because their own night fighter, the P-61 Black Widow from Northrop, was experiencing issues. They would employ these as night fighters sometimes, but more and more frequently during the day they would use them as convoy escort and anti-shipping. And so it actually earned a pretty good reputation amongst the Americans. Sorry, something fell. I'm gonna go check that. I don't think it was anything important, but could have been cat related. Be right back. Adding a little excitement there. Like I said, the Coastal Command, Mark 6Cs, they would go a little further. They would kind of tweak and customize the engines for low altitude performance, better power operations. And they would take its newly found, relatively modest bomb carrying capability and up it. In late 1942, they would start installing hardware on their Mark 6s so they could carry 18-inch British torpedoes or even American 22.5-inch torpedoes. And they started using them as torpedo bombers. Since these were already being very popular for anti-shipping, it was a logical step forward. And that's what brings us to our final version here. The Mark 10. The Mark 10 is pretty much the ultimate torpedo version. It was known as the TF, Torpedo-Fighter Mark 10. It first appeared in April of 1943. One deficiency of the MK.X, it could either carry the standard bombs under the wings, or it could carry one torpedo under the body, but it could not be quickly reconfigured. The Mark 10, though, was much more versatile. It could carry 2 500-pound bombs under the fuselage, or 1 torpedo. It's not installed in this one because it's on the stand, but here you go. Torpedo. So it would be externally hung. This didn't have an internal bay, of course. It could still carry the 2 250-pound bombs inboard, in between the engines and the body. And it would also soon be given the ability to carry 8 rockets on the outside part of the wings, either 60 or 90-pound unguided rockets. Meaning, while it could not carry everything at once, it did have better engines. They went to the Hercules Mark 7. It could at least carry more payload and have quickly reconfigurable options. It also had a new version of the Maritime radar, derived from the AI system, but made for use over the water. And one thing they started doing with the Mark.6C specifically is they put 1 Vickers 303 machine gun in the observer's bubble, blister, whatever you'd like to call it, in the back. It's kind of a compromise for not having a full turret, but at least it's something. From what I've been able to figure, the Mark.6F did not ever have this added machine gun. It was only the Coastal Command. So 1 more gun, just for a little extra rear protection, but not a big one. Still had, of course, its 10 guns in the front. And yeah, these became quite popular. They very quickly started shooting, or I should say, torpedoing ships. And some, the attack they like to do, some would be fitted with rockets, or just use their cannon, and they would come in high and fast and strafe the ships, kind of distract them, take any fighter cover away. And then Beaufighters equipped with torpedoes, sometimes they're called Torbos, is the nickname, would come in very low, basically wave top level, and use pretty pinpoint targeting, aiming to very effectively deliver a torpedo. This was thanks in good part to the good view that the canopy gave the pilot, and how roomy the cockpit, generally speaking, was. So there were some benefits to using the fat body of the Blenheim or Beaufort. As you know by now, they did, in theory, have a Mark 7, and it never went into production, and Mark 8 and Mark 9 are actually reserved for potential Australian versions. After having ones made in Britain, the Department of Aircraft Projects, DAP, And Australia decided in 1943 it would manufacture a variant of this as the Mark 21 itself. It was very similar, but the biggest difference being that instead of 6 .303 machine guns, it would have 4 .50 caliber, so American machine guns. Not a big difference, but there you go. It would also have an early autopilot. So yeah, these would continue to be used in the Pacific and Mediterranean areas, as well as elsewhere in the Atlantic. It would actually end up having a very good record of sinking enemy tonnage. They would put nearly 120 enemy vessels at the bottom, sinking over 150,000 tons. Actually, I think I said that backwards. I apologize. They sunk 177,000. Well, sorry. I'm getting tired, you can tell. But oh well. I'll refund your nickel. They sunk 177 vessels, downing 150,000 or greater tons. Very good record. Very, very good. One of the most effective torpedo bombers the Allies had of the war, period. And that would be how it would finish out its day. Not really as a night fighter where it began, but as a torpedo bomber. They would also continue to be used for close air support, dropping iron bombs, or, as more and more happened in 1944 and 45, shooting rockets at German armor. As far as production, they would build about 550 Mark.F night fighters. They would build just under 400 Mark.C long-range strikers. But really where this would take off would be with the Mark 6. Between the F and the C together, they built over 1,800. And once you add the Mark 10 to the mix, they built 2,200, a little more than these. That plus the 450 or so Mark 2s means that British production was around 5,500. Once you add Australian production, that number climbs to over 5,900. Main production would end in England pretty much right after the war in 1945, and the last aircraft would be delivered in Australia from the DAP at the very beginning of 1946. So, I'm going to come back with some thoughts on the models, a little bit more trivia, and then call it a day. Let's move on. Well, just for completeness' sake, I did say the Mark 10 was the last version, really the last major version. There was also a Mark 11 that was pretty much identical to the Mark 10, but it did not have the torpedo carrying ability, the shackles. It was a dedicated long-range strike fighter, so it was basically geared to carry rockets or bombs. But not many were made, about 160, and of course that was pretty late in the war. There was plans for a long range with drop tanks and heavier wings to support them version known as the Mark 12, but it never was put into production. And then, like I said, Australia would, in 1943, obtain everything to build their own, known as the Mark 21. It would use a different version of the Hercules engine, but still basically the same. They would first fly their own example in May of 1944. In between that time and early 1946, they would produce just over 360. So after the war, these did stay in service for a time. So unlike a lot of World War II era aircraft, they had some career afterwards. Britain had been flying the Beaufighter in Greece beginning in late 1944 and would continue to do so through 1946. So quite a ways after VE Day. Australia would continue to fly for various means, including through the Korean War period, finally retiring theirs in 1957. The RAF would take about 30 of these and transform them into target towers, target tugs, known as the TT Mark 10. And this project would happen between about 1946 and 1950. And by the 50s, these were out of frontline service. They were still used for target tugs. They were also used for training, and they were kept in reserve squadrons because Britain had a kind of a lack of aircraft when the Korean War kicked off. So they were still around. They were still flying them. The last mission for the Beaufighter in England took place on May 12th, 1960. And afterwards, all were taken off flight status. So not bad. More than a lot of aircraft would get. And as always, what do I think of the models? Well, Hobbymaster has done quite a few Beaufighters. It's kind of interesting because most of their World War II stuff is in 1/48 scale, but this is, I guess, big enough that it wasn't practical. So they've done a number of versions, kind of all on the airframe. So these two are pretty similar, and I've had for a while. I've had the 6F here for over a year, and I've had the Mark 1 for a few months. They're similar, but they're different. Mostly in the front. You can see the earlier style, kind of domed thing, hopefully, for the antennae on this one. Also, it has the original style tail. And so on and so forth. This one is, obviously the newer pattern. Set up to be a night fighter. And Hobbymaster does offer a TF Mark 10. And I was tempted to get it because this Corgi has been very slow in coming. It was supposed to be here many months ago. But I stuck it out. For one thing, it's a little cheaper. And for another, I thought, I've got two Hobbymasters. Let's see what Corgi can come up with. And this is a 01 product code, meaning they consider it a new line. And really is about the only Beaufighter they're offering at this moment. Might be fun if they did the Australian version. But I'm probably good. I don't really need any more. So, pretty similar features. Both have gear up or down. Both are diecast. Both have moving propellers. They have the same kind of antenna. They both have pilot figures. The only difference, you can pull the canopy off of the Hobby Masters to take your figures in or out. They're stuck in place, you know, they're just fixed in place on the Corgi, much as you would expect. Both are very heavy models. I think the Hobby Master might be a smidge heavier than the Corgi, but that's hard to say. One interesting thing on the Corgi, the vertical is metal and the horizontals are plastic. On the Hobby Master, it's reversed. The horizontals are metal, but the vertical is plastic. One thing I definitely like about the Corgi, the stand. It's a larger stand with more weight, and it does not want to tip over because of the wingspan on these and the typical small Hobby Master stand. I don't know if I actually had one fall over, but they wobble a lot. I think because the center of gravity, the weight's so centered, but if it was any more off balance, they probably would. I really wish Hobby Master, they have a bigger base they use for some of their planes. I wish that would just be the standard, because this is just not enough of a footprint for an aircraft this long, this wide. Oh well. I've also had a little trouble with the Hobby Master gear up doors staying on. So I use a little bit of blue tack, just, you know, gum stuff that's meant for models and handicrafts. I just stick it in there and that keeps them on just fine. I don't have any trouble with the front canopy, but this back one, the bubble, because of how it's made, it sometimes likes to pop off because it's just held in with tension. So when that tension kind of rotates, it just pops off. It's not hinged or anything. So this one is just as you see it. This one I actually put a little blue tack in as well, so just mostly so it wouldn't get lost. No, wait, excuse me, reverse that. This one is just held in. That one's the blue tacked one. My bad. Both feel quite durable, which is good because I have cats. So I've had better luck with the gear doors staying on the Corgi, even though it's my newest one, so maybe that'll change. But I have one complaint. This really disappointed me. Here's our torpedo. It is a Torpedo-Fighter. There's no way that I know of to have the torpedo mounted, shackled under the plane, and have it on the flight stand. They really should have made a stand more like a cradle type, which they do on several models, so you can have the torpedo in. It's just so instrumental to this variant. Honestly, if Corgi did single piece in-out gear like Hobby Master and Air Force One do, where the doors and all that are just one piece you pop in, I probably would just go ahead and put this one on its landing gear so I could keep the torpedo on it. But Corgi is more old school, like Hobby Master used to be, where the doors and the gear are separate pieces. And they're fine, but the more you move them, you know, it's just more likely something might get goobered up. So for now, I'll just live with not having my torpedo on, I guess. I might try to make a different stand, see if I can find a cradle from a different plane that'll fit this, though, because I'd really like to plug it in. It plugs in quite well. It's got 4 shackle points, and they all have corresponding holes in the plane, so when it's on, it mounts really well. And these are kind of a flexible bit, kind of a flexible polymer, so they won't just instantly snap off. They'll bend before they break, which is nice. I like it when they do that, especially with antennae and propellers on things, because, you know, shit happens. So which do I like better? I definitely like the Mark 10 style the most. I love the little K gun and the Vickers gun in the back. And the torpedo's neat. And this is, again, the most produced version. with this being the second most produced. So configuration wise, this is my favorite. And I definitely like the stand more on the Corgi, except for not being able to have my torpedo. Of course, it probably wouldn't work on the Hobbymaster either with their stand styles, so I don't have one of their torpedoes to know. But overall, stand aside, I think I slightly like the Hobbymaster more. It's just a little bit weightier. It is neat to be able to take your crewmen in or out. And again, they do a lot more versions, at least so far. Corgi might catch up in time, but they're kind of behind in the Beaufighter game. Hey, dryer's done. Who wants to help me do laundry? Well, guys, I appreciate you spending the day with me. I've kind of recorded this one in bits and pieces on a Sunday while doing chores and whatnot. Had to fix the washing machine. Hope I got it done. But yeah, the Beau. Some sources claim that the Japanese called this Whispering Death because the Hercules engines were quite quiet compared to other engines of the day. It's been well established this was kind of a thing made up by a British reporter. I guess you'd call it fake news today. But that, you know, kind of harkens back to the whole machine gun infield thing of World War I. It was a little quieter, but there's Japanese never really called it that. I guess it just sounded Asiatic, and it was, you know, propaganda time, so whatever. But that's a name that has kind of stuck with it, Whispering Death. It's kind of like Black Widow Luger. It doesn't really have a lot of meaning outside of collectors. And I have a full video on the Blenheim and the Mustang, excuse me, I am getting tired, and the Mosquito, 2 separate videos, as well as the Defiant, it appears, and a few videos as well. Again, I greatly appreciate it if you could like, share, and subscribe, and I will catch you very soon next time.